So I think we're starting the next session, and I'd like to welcome our two next panelists, if you could come up, Shao Jiang and Dhardon Sharling. And I'm just going to introduce them both. Dhardon Sharling was born in exile in India. Thank you. She studied at the Tibetan Children's Village Schools, which was founded by the Dalai Lama's sister, Jetsun Pemela. After college, Dhardon did have dreams of future studying for a PhD or another scholarly path, but she chose in 2008 to work as a political activist, given the protests that swept across Tibet in 2008 and the political moment. She felt it demanded that. So Dhardon is now the youngest elected member of the Tibetan Parliament in exile, and she also serves as co-chair of the International Tibet Network. And to introduce Shao Jiang as well. Shao Jiang is one of the organisers of the 1989 pro-democracy movement in China, and a former prisoner of conscience in China. He escaped from China in 1997, and after a period living in Sweden, he's now settled in London, where he's studying for a PhD, studying underground publications from 1949 to 1989. That's his PhD research, and he's currently also studying civil society and democratization in Eastern European countries and Eastern Asian countries. And now he's an independent analyst and scholar, and he has a large Twitter following, so I hope that he'll give us his Twitter handle, but he tweets a lot to a Chinese audience and has many thousands of followers. So I'll introduce, I don't know which one of you is coming up first. Dhardon.
Thanks, Kate, for the introduction. First of all, good evening, everyone present here. It's an absolute pleasure to be in Oslo, my first visit here, and particularly very, very thankful to Fritt, Benti, and Oystein from the Voice of Tibet for inviting me to be a part of this momentous gathering. I must say, I've always recognized Norway as a champion of human rights, democracy, justice, and since 1989, I've just been glued on to all the progress and developments in Norway after it conferred His Holiness the Dalai Lama with the Nobel Peace Prize. So the topic for today's discussion obviously is Tibet, a burning question for freedom. We have a fair idea of what is happening or what is transpiring inside Tibet, but I thought I'd just spare 2 or 3 minutes to give you a little background information as to how it all began, because we know what's happening currently at the moment. But it all began 64 years ago, 1949, when the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet, or rather forcibly invaded Tibet. And it's been more than 60 years since China has been forcibly ruling Tibet and trying their best to win the hearts of the Tibetan people, but have failed miserably. And the self-immolations, the unstoppable self-immolations, speaks to the effect of the China's failed policies inside Tibet. And March 1959 was what spiraled a nationwide protest that resulted in His Holiness being forced to escape into exile India, and he's been living there for the last 53 years. And in 1989, when Hu Jintao was the chairman of the United Front Work Department of the Tibet Autonomous Region, he introduced something called the martial law, and that's kind of instigated a series of violent and brutal clampdown on the Tibetans inside Tibet. And what is also very inspiring is that despite the repression, despite the use of force, despite being in the face of tyranny, the Tibetans inside Tibet did not give up. We do know in today's time there are a number of nations of governments who would willingly kowtow under the Chinese pressure because their interests are at stake. But you see on the other side, Tibetans have lost everything and yet have dared Chinese rule. And it's the values that they stand for, freedom, the due respect that His Holiness deserves, matters the most to them. And I think Tibetans' struggle with what's happening inside Tibet today stands as a testament to how people can be determined and committed to the values that they embody, and how this is their top priority and not economic interest or not resources or not political mileage. And so I think the Tibetan struggle is a glaring example to tell the world how in the 21st century, at a time where everyone is concerned about one's own interests, there is this very struggle that's maintained its originality and has in fact gone stronger. Tibetans have nothing left to lose right now, but they have kept very strongly committed to the values that they stood for, or their forefathers stood for. So basically 2008 was what changed the course of political struggle inside Tibet. Following a peaceful protest across the length and breadth of Tibet, Tibetan people have stood united more than ever before. And in 2009, Feb was what the world witnessed the first self-immolation by a young monk, Tabe. And after this incident, and after about 16 months, on the 16th of March 2011, we saw the second self-immolation by another young monk, Punzok, from the same monastery, something that Namkho had witnessed. And then on this year alone, I think we have about, just get the figures right, because when I worked on this presentation, it was 80 people who had self-immolated, and today I had to revise it and make it to 89. So this year alone, we have about 75 people who have self-immolated. So basically, I think if we trace back to the history of Tibet, it's also parallel to history of repression by the Chinese Communist Party and their repressive policies. And right now there are about 824 recognized political prisoners, but we do know that after 2008, thousands of Tibetans went either missing or went unaccounted for. But right now, we have a list of 824 political prisoners in Tibet. China, or rather the PRC, the CCP of the PRC, claims that Tibetans are amongst the 56 ethnic minorities, where Tibetans have a history of being an independent country, and despite China's use of force to assimilate Tibetan people into the mainstream Chinese community and culture, Tibetans have not relented, and that's why they're showing no signs of assimilating. And one of the key things that the Chinese government is trying to crack down very heavily is on Tibetan Buddhism, and it has been under attack. It's estimated that more than 6,000 monasteries were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, and monks and nuns are the main target of all the repressive religious policies. And right now, at this point in time, there is something called the Patriotic Re-Education campaign being enforced in the monasteries, and that was one thing that really spiraled the protests inside Kirti Monastery, where monks were forcibly taken to undisclosed location and where they were made to sign letters saying they denounce the Dalai Lama as the spiritual head. And this is one reason why a lot of Tibetans would rather give up their lives then sign a letter saying they denounce the Dalai Lama as the leaders. And again, I think it speaks to the spirit, the undefeatable spirit of the Tibetan people inside Tibet. And I would not go into this because it's environment and it sounds a little off the hook, but and also to save time. And what is also surprising is since 1959, the Tibetan people have had an unshakable belief and faith in His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I think this is one reason that really scares the Chinese leadership to death. What the Tibetans can do or has done or will do in the future to assert their faith and belief in His Holiness is something that surprises the entire world. And to an extent where the Chinese leaders are having to call the Dalai Lama by different names. Let me just quote the party secretary Tang Jingling, a former TAR party secretary, who said, "We're in the midst of a fierce struggle involving blood and fire and life and death with the Dalai clique." And the TAR chairman, Champa Pinso, who's a Tibetan, he said that the Tibetans do not want the Dalai Lama to return to Tibet. He said that 15 years ago, and 15 years later, it's very obvious what the Tibetan wants. The key demand is the return of the Dalai Lama. Even in 2008, thousands of Tibetans from all walks of life, of all different age groups, said one thing: freedom inside Tibet and the return of the Dalai Lama. And this is being reiterated and echoed by the people who set themselves alight. And in their final acts of courage or defiance, they have just one thing to say: the return of the Dalai Lama back to Tibet. And this goes on to show what His Holiness means for them and why His Holiness the Dalai Lama is of symbolic significance to the Tibetan struggle, to the Tibetan spirit, to the undying Tibetan spirit, I must say. And Dalai Lama, His Holiness, not just being a representative of the Tibetan people, but is today a global icon, and that really irks China, I must say. And his images are banned in Tibet. You saw in the video footage how all those arrested had his images either in the altar or either in their living room or in the prayer room. And all the people who self-immolated have called for his return. They've done these acts so that their desperate call for the return of the Dalai Lama could be heard. But China again chose to wear a very funny face, and they condemned His Holiness for instigating these series of self-immolations. And what was really funny was when they said that Dalai Lama's prayers for those who died in the self-immolation, because His Holiness had led a couple of prayer ceremonies organized by the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala, and they said this is acts of terrorism. So basically, again, trying to reiterate their labeling of His Holiness as a terrorist, and then telling that his prayers for the dead souls inside Tibet is an act of terrorism. And I think this is heights of mockery, or basically it just goes on to show how insecure the Chinese leadership is today of the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people and their connection with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So today, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is no longer the political head, but is in a sense the spiritual head, or rather he represents the spirit of the Tibetan people. And in fact, his devolution of political authority puts him in a much better position as the free spokesperson of the Tibetan people. So human rights in Tibet is in its worst form. China does not want to even recall Article 19A of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is freedom of speech and expression. And basically, the Tibetans in Tibet are denied of the basic rights that a minority in China is entitled to. And when you look at the people inside Tibet or get to interview people who come from Tibet, they are not even aware that such laws exist. And again, this speaks to the state of affairs inside Tibet. And so basically, Tibetans, yes, they are marginalized, they are victimized, but that does not mean that China has succeeded. As I said, they've failed to either win or to crush the spirit of the Tibetan people. And China's rule, as we call it, is in its weakest form today. Basically, they're not able to manage Tibet, they're not able to handle Tibet, and it's just going out of control. And China is committed to 3 pillars of coercive control, which is military occupation, colonial rule, fear and intimidation. If you see the footages very clearly, you could see the kind of awe and fear that's predominantly present in every area of Tibet. And this was in 2008. And you would expect the Tibetans to actually submit to this kind of fear, intimidation, and just remain silent. But no, what they choose to do is they just have overcome the fear intimidation. They're so used to it, they're sensitized, they're desensitized, in fact, to the prevalent fear. And what they're doing is their spirits rule, and it's their courage that has far surpassed the prevailing fear, I must say. And that's why Tibetans are resorting to acts of outright defiance and new forms of resistance, in fact, very creative ones. Let me get you here. One of the things that we saw coming out after the 2008 protests inside Tibet was a reassertion of the Tibetan identity. And as Oystein would say, in Tibet, now saying I'm a Tibetan is being considered criminal, and you could be punished for wearing a Tibetan dress or speaking Tibetan language. And this shows again about how insecure the Chinese leadership is of the Tibetan people. And this morning we were at Amnesty International, and the question they had is, what really makes the Chinese leadership fear or afraid? And my answer was very simple: Tibetan unity and their unshakable faith and belief in their identity in the Dalai Lama. And what you see is the protest in 2008, the repression that continued, in fact resulted in something called the cultural and the literary resurgence, where people began asserting their identity, and all the songs, the films, blogs, the books, the article, the poems that came out of Tibet had a tinge of awakening amongst the Tibetans to the consciousness of being a Tibetan, and how the unity amongst Tibetans could be the biggest strength. And so a lot of the songs that we just saw one now, but we have a lot of them on the YouTube. They are being banned in China and Tibet, but the international audience has seen these songs, and the lyrics tell you about the return of the Dalai Lama, where Tibetans visualize a future Tibet, where the Dalai Lama is in the Potala Palace and where the Tibetans are united. And basically, it just goes on to show how creative forms of resistance has evolved over the last 53 years, making the Tibetan struggle sustainable and something that's becoming very costly for the Chinese leadership to maintain. And again, a crackdown on all forms of expression of identity. Writer Shao Jiang, he wrote a book called The Line Between the Earth and the Sky, and it's being described as a sign of rediscovery of the consciousness of nationality, culture, and territory. So these writers, they do not necessarily have to write any political comments, or they don't have to necessarily resort to political writings, but any kind of writing that asserts their identity and calls for unity is being perceived as threats by the Chinese people. And he has been detained since April 2009. And the famous singer Tashi Tuntup, he was again detained in 2009 for a song, for the lyrics, in fact, a song called Torture Without Trace. If you look at the excerpts from his lyrics, I must say it's very powerful. He says, first, a sad tune for my brother hasn't returned from afar. So this again shows about how the brutal clampdown continued in the light of the 2008 protests, because his song came about at the same time. Second, the pain because there is no harmony for people. Third, the occupation and denial of freedom for Tibetans. This is all torture without trace. And he's arrested, and he in fact was put to 15 months of intense, I think, labor in a labor camp. Yes, 15 months, in a labor camp. So, and then I hope all of us know Thuntup Wangchen, who continues to receive a lot of award for his courage, for his journalism, for speaking out at a time when repression was really high in Tibet. And Thuntup Wangchen made a film called Leaving Fear Behind. In Tibetan, it's called Jigtril. And since he went missing on March 26, 2008, and later in Jan 2010, nearly 2 years after his disappearance, we got the news that he's been sentenced to 6 years in prison for subversion. And different governments have raised this issue, and as I said, he continues to be recognized. And Namkho and I were just having a chat, because Namkho, I think, personally knows Thuntup Wangchen, and they come from the same Amdo region. And Thuntup Wangchen has already served 3 years of his prison term. So hopefully after 3 years we would be able to receive this courageous man and hear from him personally of his experiences in prison, because right now his wife Lamutso is his spokesperson, and she continues to travel around the world telling about the experiences that Thundu Wangchuk went through before 2008 that compelled him to make this film, this daring film called Leaving Fear Behind. And another very interesting person, I must say, is a Tibetan female writer, singer, producer, television presenter, Jamyanki, who works for a Chinese state television house. She was arrested briefly for giving out information about the 2008 protest and for basically being loyal to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile. She was detained for 22 days, and what she did was she wrote a series of blogs narrating her experiences in prison, and the Tibetan Women's Association compiled them into a book, and today it's called The Sequence of Tortures, A Diary of Interrogations. I have 2 copies with me here today. I'd like to give one to Fritt. And so the book illustrates how after 2008 Tibetans are really kind of united. They want to just be together as one strong force, which will make it increasingly difficult for China to defeat. And so basically 60 years of Chinese rule have, I think, propelled Tibetans to be creative, to be united, to be very protective about their identity, and that's why it's becoming increasingly difficult for for China to maintain or to contain this movement. And now coming on to self-immolations, Kate has in fact elaborated on all the figures, so I'd not like to repeat them. But what is interesting is right now what we are seeing is solidarity events inside Tibet led by students belonging to different schools, colleges and universities from across the Tibet, coordinated action, though they cannot communicate via a phone or email. But then I think their spirits speak with each other to an extent where between November 26 and 28, last 3 days, what we saw was a series of solidarity actions led by the students saying we are in solidarity with the aspirations of the people who died in self-immolation, who died after the self-immolation protest. And what's also interesting is China again blames the Dalai Lama for instigating these self-immolations, and the Dalai Lama has very clearly said that it's the Chinese policies that is causing these self-immolations. And basically the political leader Sikyong Dorlop Sasenge has said that the self-immolations goes on to show how desperate the Tibetans are in getting this little bit of freedom from the oppressive Chinese regime. And a few weeks ago, we got this poster out of Tibet. The poster is in Tibetan and in Chinese, and it's pasted around the walls in Amdo and Kham, the epicenter of the self-immolations. And it's basically asking for information on the self-immolations, and people who are able to provide information are paid $8,000. And what the Tibetan groups in exile did was there was a series of numbers, and they just called the number and said, "Save Tibet, free Tibet, long live the Dalai Lama." And so basically, again, whatever China does, it's giving us an opportunity to actually talk to them or to express how displeased we are with their policies. And these are the will of the self-immolators. I'd like to read the first will. Tenzin Ketup, a 24-year-old herdsman and a former monk, and Ngawang Nobel. There was a twin self-immolation incident in June 2012, and what they said was, we do not have the ability to help Tibetans' religion and culture. We do not have the economic means to help other Tibetans. For the sake of our Tibetan race, in particular for the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet, we chose self-immolation. We want to tell all the Tibetan youth, swear to yourself, never fight against each other. Among Tibetans, we have to be united and protect our race. So I think this goes on to show how committed they are to protecting the Tibetan identity and the Tibetan culture and the Tibetan race. And so basically, if people are going to ask a question, how effective the self-immolations have been, irrespective of how we would perceive self-immolations as, but it has definitely caused a ripple in the international community and in drawing international attention and response to the crisis inside Tibet. The EU has made a number of statements, especially Lady Ashton in the picture here has made a statement during one of the gatherings. And one thing that was really remarkable is the United States has taken a very bold step to an extent where its ambassador to Beijing, Gray Locke, visited Ngaba, and from what we gather, he even spoke to the family members of the self-immolators, and a month later he came out with a very strong statement saying nobody wants that type of action or of people having to resort to that type of action, too many deaths. And he also said that these acts of self-immolation are very deplorable, and he said that the grievances should be addressed. And two congressmen from the lower house of the US Senate came out very strongly, they were very vocal on the self-immolations, and they wrote a letter to Hillary Clinton saying that US could, host an international conference on the issue of Tibet and establish a contact group, and there could be a coordinated action spearheaded by the US, wherein all the other governments and the world leaders can also take part. And this is one very significant development, and it's I think the responsibility or the pressure is for the Tibetan groups or non-governmental organizations working engaged in political activism to pursue this further. And I think the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, this was the first public statement that she made this month, and it's very powerful because she said that she was disturbed by reports of detentions, disappearances, and the excessive use of force against peaceful demonstrators, as well as curbs on Tibetan cultural rights. And she said that she had requested China to cooperate with the United Nations, and that there are 12 outstanding requests that China has to comply with, and one is very obvious that Navi Pillay herself wants to visit the affected areas in Tibet. So again, a very strong response from the United Nations. All right, so I think the question is, what now? Or what's the way forward, or what's the future like? And we all know that this month we witnessed this leadership transition in the Chinese Communist Party, and right now Tibet advocates have gone on the record to say that Tibet is going to be Xi Jinping's biggest challenge, like Taiwan was Hu Jintao's biggest challenge, and Tibet is an unresolved problem being handed over to Xi Jinping by Hu Jintao. And let me quote Tendor from the Students for Free Tibet. He said, Xi Jinping is said to inherit a wide array of challenges, but the occupation of Tibet poses one of the greatest threats to China's global standing and long-term stability. So it is in the interest of the Chinese leadership and China as a nation to actually resolve the Tibet problem and not skirt around it, or not kind of dodge all questions that Tibetans inside Tibet are raising, but to address the grievances, to get in touch with the ground reality, and to make use of this opportune moment during the lifetime of the Dalai Lama, and at a time when Namkho said Tibetans are resorting to only one thing, that is non-violent actions, and these actions are gaining in terms of strategic developments and in terms of the tactics employed by the Tibetan people. So this non-violent struggle is just growing in terms of size and scope, and before this actually spirals into something bigger that's beyond our control, I think the moment is now for the Chinese leadership. The Tibetan government in exile has very graciously agreed to not seek independence, and all we are looking for is a solution that presents benefit for both the sides. And that's why it's very important that the Chinese leadership realizes that this is a golden opportunity presented to them from His Holiness, from the Tibetan leadership, from the Tibetan people inside Tibet, who are expressing their frustration and their desperation through non-violent means. You know, when someone has the ability and the capability to kill oneself, you could well imagine that the person has the same ability to kill the other. But the Tibetans would not resort to something like this. And I think China really, really needs to realize the opportunities presented to them, and basically, and even in terms of their global standing or international repute, Tibet presents an opportunity for China to show themselves as a harmonious society, as a progressive society, as someone who's committed to human rights. And so basically they should not miss this opportunity called Tibet. And okay, so I'll just conclude here. We just had the special meeting of the international supporters who have been supporting Tibet for really long, and we have 4 results out of this, and it is basically for us to lobby for multilateral response to the crisis inside Tibet, building substantial public awareness and constituent pressure to amplify Tibetan resistance, to oppose China's re-election to the UN Human Rights Council, and basically create an alliance of downstream nations receiving Tibet's water, and to make stronger the Asian voice on Tibet in the subcontinent. And finally, I'd like to quote Tsikong Dorlosa Sengye, who said that Tibet is the test of China's rise. And as I would like to reiterate before I conclude, saying Tibet is an opportunity for China and for the world at large to test our commitment or our sense of recognizing the importance of freedom, human rights, justice, and freedom of speech and expression. So thank you all once again, and welcome questions if at all there is time. Thank you again.
So thank you. Dhardon gave the Tibetan contemporary history and the current situation. So I want to thank you, allowed me opportunity to share my experience and idea, resistance movement under the Chinese Communist Party. I focus after 1989. So it's I'm going to talk about 4 sections. Maybe I just want to short my speech, 15 minutes. 2 minutes left gave me yellow card. Okay, try. So I just talk about review about resistance methods in past 2 decades. I explore interactive action between inside action, resistance, and outside support community. Focus on the managing action inside. Maybe I push the election in Tibet, and China with outside, and together use the UN human rights mechanism. So at first we can look at the PR China constitution. They are totally inconsistency in PR China constitution. So this constitution insisted on upholding party leadership. It means upholding the Communist Party monopoly power. Meanwhile, in this constitution, declare Chinese are serving NPC, the National People Congress, is the embodiment of the serving, which is true. So that is you can look this totally in constitution. Only Chinese Communist Party hold the monopoly power. This constitution guarantee for the Communist Party monopoly power. It's not a real constitution. So during the Communist Party 63-year rule, there are now fair, regular, free election. So therefore, the Communist Party has no authority and credibility to represent people and China. Some people gave the joke, the people, Republic of China, neither people, no republic, the only republic relation in China for the Communist Party showcase. So you can look this Chinese political system. So this system is normally from Mao period to Deng Xiaoping period. Is normally the chairman of the Central Military Commission had final say. So the Communist Party different community control the different things. For example, propaganda, and they control the legal affair, some other things. So you can look a lot of people talk about the CCP power transition. Since you can look these things, you maybe think about the. I just talked before is the military, the president of the Central Military Commission have the final say. But after Deng Xiaoping period, and during Deng Xiaoping period is Deng Xiaoping appointment two top leader. One is Jiang Zemin, other is Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao uses harsh crackdown on Tibet. After that, they appointment to second generation top leader of the Communist Party. It's a very interesting thing. You can look this image. Even the old top leader retired, they have a good, very great influence to ruling the system. So you can some people think Xi Jinping is quite different. Hu Jintao is changed, but they follow the fundamental institution of the Communist Party rule. And also Hu Jintao also gave a very big influence, even he retired. So the Xi Jinping, they have two supervisors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. So this party control all the things. It's called a party state system and totalitarian system. They control all the things they try to. So let me quick look after 1989. The problem you can look a lot of social problem, poverty and the Gini index. You can look the gap between rich and the poor, scale faster in the world, and the Communist Party official family, they looting the state property, and 15% of military are Chinese Communist officials and their family. You can look the report about New York Times report the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao's case and also Xi Jinping case report by the Wall Street. The people suffering unsafe everyday life. So also Tibetan and the Chinese practice a different civil resistance. So you can look this basically the power, they use this strategy left hand. The powerless use a different strategy challenge the power. And the new media, they give some chance and link the civil movement. You can look this, the inside the Chinese netizen try to climb the correct firewall and like this butterfly. So sorry, I just focus some new civil resistance. The Tibetan movement, they also use longer struggle, civil resistance. So I suggest if you look this mass protest in China and also in Tibet, including Tibet, this figure is grows very quickly. The 2010, there are one protest every 4 minutes. So, but there's still a challenge. How the different protests set up the network and made the simultaneous movement. Because it's the Chinese government, they establish the stability system. It means they put a lot of money to keep the stability. The more the stability expenditure is more than the military expenditure. So that is quite a challenge for civil resistance. You can look at the one village Wukan uprising plus election. The basic idea, the government normally control the village. They use the Chinese Communist Party branch control all the thing, but they recall all the village leader and kick out the party branch from the village. They vote their own village leader. Also, I maybe suggest Tibetan can use this strategy. First, maybe use the Chinese law, vote their leader in village, the grassroots. Meanwhile, you can look, the government always control the election. You can vote twice. First for official vote box. The second vote to your election community box. It means this is become, you practice autonomy by yourself. Maybe you can call self-ruling. And also you have a chance, this two level, people have a chance use this vote to your own representative. And also we can look the, I just mentioned the Chinese government control all the elections, so you can set up the other, create the new election in Tibet. For example, produce the voting commission and record all representative who has not, who has been appointed by the authority. So you start your independent candidate campaign, and also can invite independent observer and the UN special report, and also you can protest unfair election controlled by government. So this is kind of the autonomy in village and grassroots level. So that is for the supporting group. I just suggestion we have the Tibetan supporting group use a lot of the UN human rights mechanism. They continue use that one. Is need the multi-action and multi-cooperation in international community. And also this coordination of the democratic countries, China policy is a very important thing. So I maybe focus 2012 to 15. There's a lot of the events in China and Tibet. Maybe inside Tibetan and Chinese made protest by using its very important anniversary. And some outside they can interact this inside resistance. So that's very important. Inside they can involve international human rights mechanism, especially next year, the UPR review in China, and also the May UN review of the implement of the ICECSR in PRC, and you can help maybe communicate inside Tibetan can join this review and deliver a shadow report and monitor all the government law and practice. So that's my suggestion. So my final point, if you look from butterfly effect to response between inside and outside, it's very important how can set up the bridge inside resistance and outside supporting community. And also very important how can set up bridge between Tibetan civil society and Chinese civil society. They fight together. And especially now, international leverage and the new digital resistance can effectively help establish bridge and network. So the current economic crisis in the world is similar to before the Second War. During that time, the more democratic country ignore the most dangerous problem. Nazi Germany and the military Japan waged war. And now the Chinese Communist Party tyranny rule maintain and change. The Communist Party hijacked the economic growth, holding raising military power, and they promote extreme nationalism to expand his power in the world. So now we have come to crossroad. The crisis in Tibet and in China leave a question: how does the global civil society interact with inside resistance? And that's very crucial question. So I leave the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Shao Jiang. And Shao Jiang makes the very important point about how do we make the connections between the Tibetans and the Chinese and the resistance inside Tibet and the supporting community outside. And Shao Jiang was just saying in an interview in the break that the Chinese always, one of the reasons why he feels that the Dalai Lama made such a wise choice in devolving political power to elected secular leadership is that the Chinese justify their occupation of Tibet as saying that the Tibetans were backward and weren't reforming, and so now, despite the fact that the Chinese always point out, don't they, the thousands of years of civilization, I think the democracy in exile has become an important identifier for the Tibetans, and something that the Tibetans are in exile are justifiably proud of, that they've reached this point at this time. So we're going to throw the floor open. We have a little bit of time for questions, if that's okay. So we have a microphone in the front here. Any questions?
Yes, I wonder, are there now at this time things are there movements now in China and Tibet who are kind of seeking some kind of a cooperation? I mean, like civil society activist groups does it exist some kind of political cooperation?
I'd like Shao Jiang.
I think since 2008, Chinese human rights lawyer and activities distant try to address the Tibetan issue. When the March 2008 Tibetan uprising crackdown, a Chinese lawyer tried to represent Tibetan protest. They're very difficult for them. All the lawyer, the license were reduced next year. So now they try to some of the environmental activities in China try to make some network Tibetan with Tibetan activities, and they're very important. This very concrete plan and project, they can bring both side activities and maybe journalists. They can cooperate together. That is social media give the new chance. Also the Tibetan, the Chinese now, protection and human rights law, they normally want to go to the government organs and ask the involved drafting country report of the UPR next year. I think if the Tibetan also take this chance, this may be good opportunities. Two sides inside activities cooperate.
My question is to you. I was just wondering if you have any contact with the Chinese embassies?
I didn't contact the Chinese embassy. Only thing, just a protest when a Chinese leader visit UK. I gave trouble, gave the leader trouble, not contact.
I'm just wondering, because Dalai Lama's political leadership has lasted for maybe 500-600 years, and it's it's very deep into both the religion and the culture and the history of the people. So I just wonder, how are the Tibetan people, both in Tibet and outside Tibet, reacting upon his choice to withdraw?
Yeah, so basically your question, it took a lot of emotional burden for the Tibetans to reconcile with the fact that we're no longer going to have His Holiness the Dalai Lama or the institution of the Dalai Lama as the political representative of the Tibetan people. And even today, I must say, we haven't yet fully reconciled with this understanding. But what we do know is whatever has happened, and this was something actually, we didn't have a choice to say no. It was something that was kind of imposed and enforced onto the Tibetan parliament to amend the charter, saying that His Holiness and his institution, Ganden Podang, will not have any political role or responsibilities. And but what we do know right now at this point in time is, or rather, in hindsight, we do know whatever happened for the best. Because His Holiness is a visionary, he's a global icon, he's a global leader. And what we're also seeing is the increasing dependency on him by the Tibetan people, both inside and outside Tibet, to an extent where practically a post-Dalai Lama era would be fatally critical for the Tibetan struggle. The question of the whole sustainability of the struggle in the post-Dalai Lama era was becoming a pressing issue and a pressing concern. So His Holiness was very clear that Tibet and the Tibetan struggle, the Tibetan movement, does not end and begin with the Dalai Lama. But in fact, though His Holiness plays an important component or an aspect to it, but Tibetans have to learn to move beyond. It's like a father wanting his child to walk after months of crawling. And I think that's what he has done. And now, as Kate said it, I think the democracy that we have in exile, all these changes, the transition sends out a strong message to China, how civilized, how progressive the Tibetan struggle, the Tibetan movement, or the Tibetan political movement is. And though emotionally, I would say on a more personal level, it's quite daunting, or it's what do you call it, challenging for Tibetans to accept this. But the strides that we have made in the last 12 months with the new political leader goes on to show the extent to which the Tibetan struggle can actually move forward and can sustain in a post-Dalai Lama era. And so His Holiness and his decision was a very practical step. And I think in the next couple of years, we will also agree with this decision and say, yes, that was the right decision made.
Yes, the situation inside Tibet is very critical. Yesterday there was one self-immolation, today there was one, and tomorrow there will be one, I'm sure. And at this such a critical time, if we look at the Tibetan movement, we see three important challenges right now. One is the global indifference. When I say global indifference, I'm referring to media and governments. There's a very little support, real support, towards the situation in general and the self-immolation inside Tibet in particular. And then there's the other challenge is the state of denial in Beijing. When you see that kind of denial with forced or promoted by the conservatives in Beijing. And the third challenge is the loss of selfless, young, dedicated people's lives. So these three challenges now really put a very important question to all those who are engaged for the cause of Tibet or the situation inside Tibet, is that what now there have been, there has been kind of persistent strategy, but these strategies, in a way, they have been very good at raising the level of awareness, but it hasn't produced result, effect inside Tibet. So is it now, right now, is it a question to all of us, to all those who are engaged in the cause of Tibet, is that could there be another viable, effective strategy to come forward? Thank you. And I want to add one more to Shao Jiang's proposal. I think Shao Jiang's proposal is a very good idea, but want to add one thing, that the situation inside China and inside Tibet is quite different when it comes to village election. In Tibetan area, you can't really elect village leaders. There is only selection process. So it's very difficult actually to create a kind of election, separate kind of election, or to elect someone that you really want. So there's a difference of situation, but of course it's always a good idea to kind of to see, compare and improve the situation.
Yeah, coming to your first question, the new strategies. I wouldn't say the efforts on part of the Tibetan leadership in exile and the international community has failed. If at all something has failed, it's the Chinese response to it. And I think the different propositions that we came up with in the last 53 years have been successful to an extent where there is a growing international interest in the Tibetan issue, and to an extent where the Tibetan people inside Tibet have not given up. I think had we failed in our strategies and in our use of means and ways to handle the movement, I think Tibetans inside Tibet would have given up. But looking at the spirit, the fortitude, it goes on to show that the Tibetan leadership and the Tibet movement in the international fora has been successful. But right now, what is required is the Chinese response to it. Tangible, unpretentious, earnest response from China, I think, is what required at this point in time. But having said that, I think we do know that there has been no solution to the crisis, or rather the peaceful solution or the resolution to the Tibet crisis that we have proposed has not gained momentum amongst the Chinese leadership. And therefore, we will have to consistently and persistently pursue this, I think, to an extent where the Chinese leadership has no choice but to resort to this, to resort to whatever we are proposing to them, because that serves mutual interests of both Tibet and China. So basically, I would say the onus is on the Chinese leadership, basically, to respond to the strategies that we have been using so far.
Thank you. I think that we do have to wind up now, unless Shao Jiang, you want to make a very quick comment.
Right, you are right, totally right. In the Tibetan area, the control more strict than in China area, but they still can try. Is a positive things because the Tibetan, they have own culture, they have share the own religion. Actually, the Communist Party not crush whole the network. So even if you talk about after the 1603 rule, the Chinese the culture is destroyed much more. It's only the Communist Party version. Now it's only underground. But Tibetan, the underground way, underground the network is better in China, especially from the whole area in village and in nominate. That is a good thing. Even you can compare the solidarity in Berlin during the martial law. You can still try to, even if they control very strictly, you can set up the underground network. It means just village level, and village to village, they can make the big snowball, and this network you can make the other channel. You talk about we use the Chinese law. In the meantime, we create the other channel to practice right. I know it's very difficult, but you must practice this one. They have a chance, because the election is means you can look at all the democratization. Election can mobilize all the people together, and they can self-rule. They can ignore the Chinese rule, Communist Party rule, and you can get the legitimacy from whole the Tibetan, and that's very important thing.
But I'll just make two very quick points in response as well, very briefly, in terms of global media coverage. I think that in comparison to self-immolations perhaps in other parts of the world, I would say that the Tibetan self-immolations have had an impact internationally, and I think that what's been happening more recently is that people are looking much more deeply at the reasons and the causes for the self-immolations, and I think that that's important. They're looking to really understand why those self-immolations are happening. Absolutely right about China. I think that the role of China today on the world stage is unprecedented historically. We do need to look at very new strategies because the international community is just not going to be prepared to confront China in the same way as perhaps it was, and we can see that very clearly in Norway with the consequences from giving the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo. And then also, I think that what we're seeing important development inside is that a new generation of Tibetans, often they speak Chinese just as well, if not better than Tibetan, are challenging policies, laws and measures from inside based on a really thorough understanding of those laws and measures and positions of the Chinese authorities. And I would say also that what the Dalai Lama has pioneered over the years, the last 20 years, is outreach to the Chinese community, and I think that that's critical. And Shao Jiang is among many Chinese who are seeking to deepen that relationship. So thank you all very much for bearing with us, and I'm sorry that we overran. That's my responsibility as moderator. I'm sorry for that. And I'd like to just applaud my fellow speakers. Truly passionate and courageous advocates of great bravery. And I'd like to thank again Oystein from Voice of Tibet for helping to bring us together, and the Voice of Tibet, Tibetan Service of Radio Free Asia, Tibetan Service of Voice America provide a vital role in ensuring that Tibetans inside Tibet are kept informed and don't feel so isolated. First and foremost, to thank Fritt for their very generous invite to us all to come and speak to you all and meet you all in Oslo, which is hugely appreciated, and Fritt doing extremely valuable work, which is deeply appreciated, I think, by everybody in this room. So thank you very much.